Productivity is the ratio of total work done to hours it took to do it. Now, when the boss calls you on the weekend, it's not usually because there's more work to do. It's usually because it didn't get done during the week. Often because of the boss's own mismanagement or not keeping track of deadlines and so on. So that's why you have to work on the weekend. And so you're actually being asked to work more hours to more or less do the same amount of work. And that is the exact opposite of productivity growth. That will actually reduce productivity.
One for mum, one for dad, one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains politics, policy and economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and this week the Albanese government's second Closing Loopholes IR bill was passed in the Parliament. Part of this bundle of new industrial relations laws is a new provision to protect Australian workers' right to disconnect. This measure is one that aims at preventing workers from being penalised at work if they fail to respond to unreasonable phone calls, emails, texts and other messages from employees that are outside of their work hours. And it's caused a bit of controversy.
Onto IR and the right to disconnect.
When new right to disconnect laws take effect.
The government and the Greens have reached an agreement, so employees have the right to disconnect from their employers after hours.
This could include fines for employees who contact their staff after work,
except in exceptional circumstances or when they're officially on call.
If you start screening the boss, you're not going to get very far.
Bosses are threatening to roll back working from home arrangements.
But business groups say it could hurt industries where employers need to contact staff in different time zones.
See, that this could happen in a country that used to pride itself on hard work.
There's now the spectre of jail sentences for any boss who might have to call their staff over the weekend. They are already drowning in red tape.
They go in complete overreach.
Work-life balance is important.
Talking with me about this today and the right to disconnect, what it means for Australian workers and some of the details of this bill is Dr. Jim Stanford, economist and director at the Centre for Future Work. G'day, Jim.
Hello, Ebony.
So, Jim, before we get into the right to disconnect, just tell me a little bit about this Closing Loopholes bill, because I believe it passes a couple of industrial relations laws, not just the right to disconnect. Is that right?
Yes, it's a kind of an omnibus bill, if you like, that makes changes in several different areas of our labour law in Australia. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it's part two of a bigger omnibus bill. The first half was passed before the Christmas break, and now this is the second part. And there have been other changes that the Albanese government has made as well. Really, this is, if you count them, the fourth significant industrial relations bill that they've brought through. So they've clearly made trying to make the labour market a bit fairer one of their top priorities in government, and they deserve credit for it.
Mm. Let's get into this idea of the right to disconnect. Mm-hmm. What is that about initially? Can you just explain it for people who might not be familiar with that term at all?
Well, I think everybody understands that digital technology now follows us everywhere, and it can allow your boss to follow you everywhere as well. Between your mobile phone and your texts and your emails and your WhatsApps and every other way they have of getting a hold of you. It's become harder and harder to leave work behind when your shift is over and you go off to enjoy your life with your family or your recreation or even your leave, your annual leave. Work-related requests can follow you anywhere. So in a way, we're just trying to catch up to the reality of modern technology with these changes in labor law. And the provisions, even though there's been a lot of heat and noise and shock and awe in the debate about this, the provisions of the right to disconnect in the Closing Loopholes bill are frankly very, very modest. They basically state that a worker shouldn't be penalized or punished or fired because they didn't return an email or a text message from their employer outside of regular working hours. And if a worker is receiving such requests that they think are unreasonable, they can raise the concern with the Fair Work Commission or working through their union. And if the Fair Work Commission agrees this is not a reasonable, reality of the job that person does, then they can issue an order where the employer would have to stop contacting you. There'll also be provisions probably written into many of our modern awards as a result of this legislation, which will define what's reasonable and what isn't reasonable for different types of jobs. Clearly, there are some jobs where, in the event of an emergency or disruption or something like that, you should expect you're going to have to be, contacted on the weekend. But there are many, many other jobs where there's no reason other than the boss's own disorganization why they're calling you up on the weekend. And in jobs like that, they shouldn't. They should get their act together and recognize your weekend is your weekend.
Yeah.
When you clock off, you'll be able to switch off.
What it's intended to do is to allow a worker who is repetitively and unreasonably contacted to not answer that email.
So exactly as you've said, this is a feature of some jobs and presumably forms part of some agreements already. How widespread has this issue been addressed in the past, and what kind of gaps was this legislation looking to fill? Is this becoming a bigger and bigger problem?
Yes, it is. Ebony, through the Centre for Future Work and the Australia Institute, we do that annual Go Home on Time Day report where we survey Australian workers and ask how many hours are you working outside of your regular paid time, and that could be traditional ways of working unpaid overtime, like coming in early or working through lunch or your breaks. But increasingly, our surveys have shown that it also means work following you home through your digital devices. And we did some custom survey research on that topic, including during the pandemic when so many people were working from home. Then the boundary between work and life became even blurrier, right? And we did find that, first of all, the amount of total unpaid overtime being worked has grown a lot in Australia. Our latest report showed, on average, an Australian worker worked 280 hours in the year extra without pay. And that is an enormous amount of time for each worker. But across the whole labor market, it's massive, $130 billion worth of work time not being paid for. And much of that is clearly because of the extended reach and sort of instantaneous availability that is expected through these digital devices. Now, we've seen various policy initiatives around the world, not just in Australia, to address this problem. You've had some European countries that have passed laws on the right to disconnect that are, frankly, quite a bit stronger than this one that's just coming in Australia. You've also seen trade unions get on the issue, starting with some professions where, being on call is a big deal, and the unions tried to negotiate reasonable rules regarding how on-call arrangements were to be handled in industries like healthcare or policing, for example. But in Australia now, I think at last count, there's over 50 enterprise agreements that different unions have negotiated with different language. But all of it aimed at one goal, and that is the employer cannot just take it for granted that you're available 24/7, even though they're only paying you for 8 hours Monday to Friday. They have to organize themselves so that they don't need to disrupt you on the weekend, and when they do, they should pay you for it. So in many different kind of shapes and forms, that's the basic principle that is being pursued here. And this legislation isn't going to be an enormous change, but I think it plants a flag in the sand, if you like, around the whole idea that just because you're employed by someone doesn't mean they own you.
When employees want to play hardball, they should expect that their employer will play hardball back.
A perfect sign today of Australia's decline.
So there's been a bit of controversy around this and a lot of backlash, I guess, from the business community talking about how this is going to negatively impact productivity in particular, but also threatening this idea that other flexibility in the workplace will be at risk from this. What's your response to that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, in Australia, any discussion about industrial relations and labor law is always, World War III, because they call out the big guns on even changes that are very, very modest. So this refrain from business that the sky is going to fall if we go ahead with this change. One business leader said that it's the final step in Australia becoming a banana republic. And other types of hyperbole. frankly, is losing its impact. Every single change that's come in, from a higher minimum wage to some of the modest changes around enterprise bargaining rules that the Albanese government brought in last year, to all of these changes. Every time the business community stands up and says, this is going to destroy the work ethic, this is going to destroy our economy, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to view those claims with enormous suspicion. They're simply fighting the same old battles. And all of these changes that have come into effect so far have had hardly any visible impact on how the economy is functioning. Frankly, if anything, I'd say we're too modest. Now, with this right to disconnect, this is an interesting one, Ebony, because I think you're getting a bit of a generation gap showing itself. To be honest, if I can put it bluntly, it's old boomers who are the most up in arms about this idea that workers would not answer their phone on the weekend. And we get all kinds of, pounding the table and saying, Dad, burn it in my day, a worker was available all the time, and they understood the value of work, et cetera, et cetera. It's almost funny. And then the amount of support that our polling and other research has shown for the idea comes especially from young people who understand the reach of digital devices and why you have to put limits on them. So some of the hyperbole has been ridiculous. The mayor of Perth, a big liberal out there, said, this is not the spirit Australia was built on, Well, I think that was maybe inadvertently illuminating, since Australia was built on, prison labor. I guess the idea that you should work for free whenever your boss wants you is somehow ingrained in the Australian spirit, but I don't think that's what he meant. Another over-the-top claim, absolutely over-the-top claim, was from the opposition leader, Mr. Dutton.
Then we are going to see a continuation of the productivity problem in our country, and as the Reserve...
He said that this will destroy Australia's productivity, and he vowed to undo these changes if he leads a future government.
That's interesting because, in the past, the coalition has been very concerned that having an electric vehicle might, for example, destroy the weekend. But here we've got the opposition leader being, oh, no, I expect all Australian workers to be on call 24/7.
Oh, that's a good one, Ebony. I never thought of that contradiction. We already know the weekend's gone because of electric vehicles, so what are you complaining about, right?
And I'm really disturbed to hear Mr. Dutton say, he wants to end the weekend. He wants people at their barbecues to be taking those phone calls.
How many hours we work, than people all around the world. We work an extra 6 weeks unpaid a year. And so when Peter Dutton, or for that matter, employers say that we're not flexible, that's laughable and actually pretty insulting.
Also, I think in a way his comments about productivity opened up a bigger discussion and really revealed the flaws in how the arguments around productivity are wielded by employers and employer-friendly organizations. Because when you think about this, how is giving people the right to disconnect actually bad for productivity? How is being able to tell the boss, no, I'm not answering your email on the weekend, how does that actually hurt productivity? It actually would help productivity for basic maths. In economics, productivity is defined as the ratio of how much you produce divided by how many hours it took you to produce it, okay? So there's nothing in that very simple formula that says anything about whether you're getting paid for your work or not, or what the conditions of it are. And yet productivity is often invoked as this sort of, magic word to make us bend over backwards and tighten our belts and do things that might be painful but are good for your employer. That isn't actually what productivity is. And Mr. Dutton's comments are a glaring example of how people who wield this productivity argument don't even understand the concept. Productivity is the ratio of total work done to hours it took to do it. Now, when the boss calls you on the weekend, it's not usually because there's more work to do. It's usually because it didn't get done during the week, often because of the boss's own mismanagement or not keeping track of deadlines and so on. So that's why you have to work on the weekend. And so you're actually being asked to work more hours to more or less do the same amount of work. And that is the exact opposite of productivity growth. That will actually reduce productivity on an hourly basis, properly measured. More importantly, the biggest reason is that, giving people a chance to have a weekend and a balanced life and take care of their family is actually good for their mental and physical health. And that is what actually is essential for productive workers and well-run industries and good workplaces.
Younger people we spoke to said while they don't mind being on call, mental health and a work-life balance was top priority for them.
So in that sort of longer run sense, clearly, work-life balance in general and the right to disconnect on the weekends is pro-productivity, not anti-productivity. But in the sort of culture wars language of modern politics in Australia, it's that point is lost.
So, Jim, if someone is out there listening right now and they're kind of not sure what this legislation means for them, how would you kind of summarize it for them?
Well, the right to disconnect in specific means that you should understand that just because you have a job, your employer doesn't have the right to call you at any time of the day or night or on the weekend or during your leave. And if you feel that they're contacting you unreasonably, that is too often or for reasons that easily could have waited until Monday morning, then you have the absolute right to complain about it. You could complain about it through your union rep if you have a union, and you should join a union, or you could file a complaint with the Fair Work Commission, which will then look at this and think about whether this is reasonable or not. So now, frankly, not many people are going to do that, right? How many people are going to say, I'm off to the Fair Work Commission today because my boss called me on the weekend? So in this regard, it's more of a cultural shift and a shift in expectations. The fact that employers know that this is now a right that's described in the law, and employees know that it's a right described in the law, I think is going to change employers' behavior. They're going to think twice about, routinely bugging people out of hours. And employees are going to have a different set of expectations. Sort of like those cultural norms are very important. They're hard to pin down and they're hard to arbitrate, but they are very important in terms of how both workers and bosses think about the employment relationship. And this is I would say, an incremental and in some ways very fluid step in the right direction. It kind of signals to everyone, you know what? Just because you're an employee doesn't mean you should be available 24/7, whether you're being paid out of hours or not. That's exactly how the Prime Minister put it in his comments the other day.
Someone who's not being paid 24 hours a day shouldn't be penalised if they're not online and available 24 hours a day.
And I thought he was bang on.
Thanks, Jim.
My pleasure, Ebony. Thanks for having me.
That was Dr. Jim Stanford, economist and director of the Centre for Future Work at the Australia Institute. Thanks so much for joining us on this episode of Follow the Money. If you liked today's discussion and found it enlightening, please rate and review us. It helps other people to find the show. And you can head on over to australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research and analysis, and to the Centre for Future Work at futurework.org.au for all their research on the right to disconnect and all the research from Go Home on Time Day. You can find us on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS, and I'm at Ebony_Bennett. Jim Stanford is at Jimbo Stanford. And remember, for a closer look at the economic landscape, subscribe to our new weekly podcast, Dollars and Cents, with our chief economist, Greg Jericho. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.